Hello, Adrian here. So we now know how to add materials to our buildings, move our stuff around into them, populate it with objects and scale them and manipulate them and all that. But we've had, well, two things that we need to sort of pay attention to. The first thing is that our model looks a bit dark, so we need to actually now use what we've learned within applying materials. So let's grab ourselves something that we can actually now be able to see all of our geometry with. So let's just give it a simple white material so we can actually see what we're doing. Just as a note, we have to hold shift when we apply these if we want to apply it to the entire object, just because sometimes these objects are actually broken down into smaller objects, as we sort of covered before. So make sure you hold shift as you drag these onto things. So now we're able to see the shading on our objects, but we also have noticed for a while that we've had this little error in the top left corner. And the reason that it says this error is because the way that Unreal works is to essentially work faster and be able to produce all these frames that it's producing, which you'll be able to actually show by clicking on this arrow and show FPS. So you're actually able to see how poorly your model's going. So seeing that it's going at 12 isn't very good. We want to keep it at above 30 or 60 or 120. Probably 60 is a mark that you want to be staying around at, just because these frames, when in VR, have to be split between both eyes. So if you have it going at 30 frames a second, that's 15 per eye, which will make you throw up because it's really jagged and it's not very good because your head will be moving behind it, as we covered in the Hedgehog video. But to fix this and make it run a bit faster, we need to make these objects bake lighting. But there's a couple of problems with that, and I'll show you why that is in a moment. But first off, let's get rid of this error. So what we need to do is we need to go on to Build and click Build Lighting Only. And building the lighting is essentially telling Unreal to render out the lighting map. And when I say map, it's kind of like a texture that's applied, or a material that's applied to every object that gives it its shadow. So it doesn't have to do that for every frame. And so if you click on that, it'll start chugging along. It'll set up a swarm connection. Gotta embrace the swarm. This basically is telling if we have a whole bunch of a render farm going, it'll send it off to the render farm to do, but we don't have one, so it's just going to do it on the computer. You can see it's building the lighting in the bottom right hand corner. And what it's doing is it's taking all of the photons from that sun up there, and when I say that sun, I mean really whatever lighting object is hidden in here, which is actually tucked over here. So this sun is making lighting. And okay, so we have an error window. And this error is essentially saying that our UVs are broken, what UVs are is, it's basically, if you think of when you were sort of in high school or primary school geometry, you may have made a little box net, which is like a folded out box with little tabs that you sort of cut out and glue together and it makes a box. And basically within all of the objects in Unreal, they have to be unfolded flat out to put a texture onto them. So if we open up any texture, you'll know that there'll be a sort of square version of it, and everything has to be folded out into that. And what's happening is that each of these objects, when they're folded out, they kind of overlap because, well, there's the object isn't sort of made into a net. So I'll demonstrate with this fence. So let's click on this little name of the fence. This will actually bring it up in the content browser, so it's quite handy if we're trying to figure out why something's broken. Let's open it up in the asset viewer. Let's close our error because we know this is broken. And so we'll see all these little pickets. And so these pickets are representation of the fence. And I mean, that is the fence. And if we look up on the top, we've gone through the sort of bounds of, we've gone through the collision of objects, and we can click on other things to show information about the geometry, but we haven't clicked UV yet. And if we click UV, what it does is that shows the map of how this is unrolled to be textured. And so what's happening is that instead of there being one map for for each of these, as there should be, so each of them get their own shadow, all of the maps for all of them have been superimposed. So what's happening is that if this one over here gets a bit of shadow on it from a tree or something, it's going to be applied to all of them. And likewise, if there's a tree shading this one and a tree shading this one, it's going to apply both of those shadows on top of it. And so what you end up with is a big, messy, sort of dark texture that's not very useful. And so what's happened now, if we close that tab, is that that's what we see over here, is that this is the sort of mangled shadow map that's come from that. And so we don't really want that because that's going to make for weird shadows. So even though this one's kind of worked, where we get a bit of shadow coming off of it, it's not exactly what we want. And so if you were to make these bits of geometries UV maps mapped correctly, and we have actually some video tutorials that we made in a previous semester on this that demonstrate how to map in Rhino. We'll link those in the description. But basically, you have to go through a certain process to do that. And most Unreal objects that you buy off the marketplace has already been built to do this. And you can also build objects and other bits of software that does respect UV maps. But for the time being, we don't really have the time or sort of skills to do that. So we need to do something else. And if we go over to our transformation information, that guy, we'll notice that there's this little mobility tab. And we didn't really mention that before, but what this lets you do is specify what kind of lighting it gets, as well as whether it can move, which is a bit expected. So if something's set as static, it'll save on rendering time by saying that can get one lighting map, which saves on having to render its lighting every frame. We can also set it to stationary, which what stationary does is it renders using the dynamic lighting once, and then just keeps that dynamic lighting, which is a much better way of going about it if you haven't mapped it properly, because it's not quite as efficient, but it's pretty good. And we can also do movable, which for things that we might be shooting around like these boxes, which are already set to movable because otherwise we couldn't move them, means that those will get their own little dropped shadow coming off of them. So what we want to do is we want to grab all of our objects we haven't mapped properly, or anything that's brought up errors, and set it to stationary, because we know we don't want these getting pushed around. If we do want them to pushed around, just set it to movable, but we're going to set it to stationary just for sake of ease. And we're going to build lighting again. And so now that we've set that to stationary and we're building our lighting, this will run probably about the same speed. And now you shall see that this is now being mapped properly. So we'll see that there's some shadow being cast from the overhang of the roof. We'll see that one side of the fence is shaded evenly and the other side of the fence is lit a bit more. And there should be a little shadow coming off the edge of it, which is good. And if we go to play and pew a bit, we can see that these are now casting dynamic shadows. And so our frame rate's also gotten a little better, which is good. So not much better, but a little better. And that's just because it's not rendering, it's not having to do as much, because now those shadows are cached. And we've also gotten rid of that error up top. So that is the basics of building our lighting, which makes sure that our lighting looks as it should. Just the last thing to note is if you ever change the materials on your objects, be aware that it does actually change the build. So if I drag this generic grass, and it's going to take a moment to load it into the level, and it's still going because it's freaking out because it's a new material it has to put in the cache. And this computer's really slow. Just as a note, if you go into the top left and it's not crashed, there we go. If you go into the top left and it's not crashed, you can turn off real time, which means that it only renders frames as you move the camera, which makes it a lot more efficient. So there we go. So that's some grass. So we got some grass, and we need to get ourselves another build lighting. And once we've built this lighting, it should make a very slight difference to our map, and probably not really perceivable. But if you have materials that are even slightly reflective, or if you're getting a lot of light bouncing off surfaces, it's not quite visible here, but it will happen that you'll end up with green being applied to things. And so just be aware that the material color and how much it also reflects in light affects the build. In this instance, it doesn't, just because we don't have the exact materials that cause that, but it is something that happens. So that's just something to note and remember, and that's the basics of building lighting to make your models look gorgeous. So thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.
This project was supported by a UTS Widening Participation Strategy, First Year Experience Grant, funded through the Australian Government Higher Education Participation and Partnership Program. The videos were produced by Matthew Austin and Adrian Taylor.